Well, welcome everybody to Vital Grounds November book talk with author Dan Flores. We're delighted to have you joining us tonight. My name is Matt Hart. I am the communications director and resident English major on the Vital Grounds staff. So it's my pleasure to host events like this when we periodically hold them. And I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who are attending tonight for joining us for what should be a very inspiring evening, and also thank all of you who are supporters of Vital Grounds conservation work to protect habitat for grizzly bears and for all the other amazing wildlife that we share the landscape with here in the Northern Rockies. Vital Grounds work fits into a long tradition of people shaping their relationship with the landscape around them. And that is a tradition that Dan Flores has documented in much of his work as an environmental historian and author, and particularly in the book that we'll be focusing on tonight, his latest, which is called Wild New World, an epic story of animals and people in America. There it is. And so I think Dan's a really perfect choice for Vital Ground to host in the way that he can help us see the conservation work that Vital Ground and our partners do in a larger context of deep history, as he calls it in the book. The ever-evolving relationship between humans and the other animals that we share North America and the larger world with. So it's great to have Dan here. Just a little bit more information about Dan. He's the A.B. Hammond Professor Emeritus of Western History at the University of Montana. So he's got some ties up here in grizzly country and has spent a good chunk of time in Montana. He lives in Santa Fe now, which is where he's joining us from. And Dan is the author before Wild New World of the best-selling books Coyote America and American Serengeti. His latest book, Wild New World, won the prestigious Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award this year, which is a wonderful honor, and we're delighted to host a winner of that award. And it's shortlisted for the Ralph Waldo Emerson Award from Phi Beta Kappa Society. It's a Kirkus Review book of note. So just a book that is already gaining widespread acclaim, and it certainly should. It's a wonderful chronicle of deep history, as we said, the long winding relationship between humans and the non-human animals of North America. So without further ado, we'll get going with Dan. Just the last logistics for the evening. Dan will talk and read from the book for half hour, 45 minutes perhaps, and then we'll have time for some question and answer after that. So we do have the Q&A function here on Zoom, which you should be able to find in the menu, different options at the bottom of your screen. So as Dan is talking, if a question comes up, feel free to type it into the Q&A function, and we'll have time to answer a few questions from folks in the audience after Dan's presentation. And then once again, if you know folks who wanted to make it tonight but couldn't, we will be posting the recording of this to Vital Grounds YouTube channel. So you can find it there in a few days' time. Okay, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dan Flores and mute myself and enjoy the evening with the rest of you. Thanks again for joining us, Dan, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks to Vital Ground for hosting this, and to my old friend Kim Davitt, who asked me to do this a few months ago, and also to obviously all of you who are out there logged into this. Thanks for spending a bit of your evening with Wild New World, which is a book I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a sample of some flavor of it over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of sprinkle a handful of brief readings from the book through a kind of a general talk about what it does. But probably the best way to start is the first couple of epigrams that appear. The only two I use actually in Wild New World are these. So I'm going to read them to you because obviously, since I put them at the start of the book, I thought this was a good way to begin an epic story like this. This first one is from the book of Ecclesiastes. And if you've never come across this quote, it's a very intriguing one from that source. That which happens to men also happens to animals. And one thing happens to them both. As one dies, so dies the other, for they share the same breath. And man has no preeminence above an animal, for all is vanity. And then this one. There is grandeur in this view of life. Whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. And for those of you who are up on your Charles Darwin, you probably know that that is how On the Origin of Species ends, with that sentence. So let me read just a brief selection from the very beginning of Wild New World. This is how Wild New World starts. And I wanted to read it in part because not only does it launch the book, but it conveys something about what kind of book this is. I was an English major as an undergraduate, like Matt, so I am very interested in storytelling and characters and character development, and a lot of the things that sort of go into literary works like novels. And so I tend to write using some of those techniques. And with that said, here's how Wild New World begins. It was the lead up to a presidential election, an unsettling late summer for many Americans, since the hugely popular incumbent, Theodore Roosevelt, was declining to run for president a second time. The national gossip centered around whether portly William Howard Taft, who Roosevelt handpicked as his successor at Chicago's Republican Convention that June of 1908, could possibly follow the charismatic advocate of the strenuous life. Somehow Taft seemed an unlikely replacement for the president who does not shrink from danger, from hardship. So the news story out of the remote Southwest late that August initially seemed little more than a momentary distraction from politics, even if for some it might have been a reminder of the kind of heroic leadership the country was losing. What the nation read in its newspapers was that on the night of August 27, a 65-year-old telephone operator named Sally Rook had gotten a call that an immense thunderstorm hovering over the Colorado-New Mexico border had spawned a flash flood in the dry Cimarron River. With a debris-choked wall of water ripping straight for the town of Folsom, New Mexico, Rook had spent a crucial half hour frantically calling every local number on her switchboard, saving scores of people. Then the flood had torn through Folsom and swept her away, along with half the town. Sally Rook's heroism became a national story. Telephone operators around the country contributed thousands of dimes for a memorial. But eventually the story faded from the papers. Folsom had imagined itself competing with Colorado Springs 100 miles up the Rockies. But the town never recovered. Today, Colorado Springs has 500,000 people. Folsom has 80. In the days immediately following the dry Cimarron flood, an African-American cowboy named George McJunkin was riding through grassy parkland, a few hundred yards below the rimrock of a miles-long mesa that extended eastward from the Rocky Mountains, checking for ranch fence lines damaged by the flood. Suddenly, McJunkin's horse braced, its hooves furrowing into foot-deep mud at the edge of a ragged scar floodwaters had cut into the slope below the mesa. McJunkin leaned out of his saddle to peer into a fresh chasm sliced into the brown shale. What he saw changed the story of America forever. That's all I'm going to read of the introduction to the book, but what McJunkin saw was what became the world famous Folsom site, which was the first evidence we Americans ever had that native people had been on the continent, not just a couple of thousand years before Europeans arrived, which is what many of the scholars of the time thought, but in fact, all the way back to the period when extinct animals roamed North America. The Folsom site was a site with 32 extinct bison. Bison antic was one of the giant bison that went extinct during the Pleistocene, and it demonstrated conclusively that humans had been on the scene. So only 100 years ago is when the archaeological site that concluded that Folsom was at least 12,000 years old was done. That was in the 1920s, as I said, just 100 years ago. So it's only been that long that we've actually known how old the human story is in North America. I'm going to read you one other little selection. This is from chapter 1, which is called A Prologue in Deep Time. And, well, this is self-explanatory. The wild new world that greeted the first human arrivals was a more ancient place by far than humanity itself. Immense time and relentless evolution, plus at least one cosmic wild card, had sent history off in a dramatic new direction, had painted a wondrous canvas of biological life in North America. Yet historical unpredictability lay at the seams of the America we humans found. The one certain truth about our Earth is that everything could have turned out differently. It was that shock to the timeline that sets this story in motion. 4 times in the planet's early history, it had suffered and ultimately survived global extinction events. Earth's 5th extinction event was a special one, though. Given the evidence for widespread planetary bombardment elsewhere in our solar system, we have to assume cosmic collisions on Earth aren't exactly rare. A few years ago, I walked around a remarkable half-mile wide impact crater in northern Arizona that offers surviving evidence of that. But on planets where life has evolved, even fairly common impacts are dangerous because they threaten ecological disruptions. The one in question, though, wasn't common. And this was especially unlucky for North America because its land masses were in the bullseye of one of Earth's biggest contingency events. 66 million years ago, North America was not even a single piece of ground yet. The continent was in 2 major pieces, with the western interior seaway inundating much of today's southeast and from the Great Plains to the Great Basin. This shallow ocean entirely separated the eastern landmass, Appalachia, from the large western chunk, Laramidia. That approaching contingency was 7.5 miles in diameter, a rocky chunk ejected from the outer asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. It had almost certainly crossed Earth's orbit many times in the planet's history, whizzing by within sight of the life below. Millions of years in the future, scientists would recognize this Death Star as a carbonaceous chondrite, one of the most common of the various meteorites. What distinguished this one was its gargantuan size and the speed of its approach. The cosmic projectile was hurtling at 27,000 miles per hour, and as it approached Earth, the bottom end of the western interior seaway assumed form directly below it. Today, that's the northwestern tip of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, near the Mayan pueblo of Chicxulub, a village that now graces this solar system level event with its interesting lyrical name. This was no glancing hit. The enormous rock smacked into an immovable backstop of water, mud, rock, and life at an angle guaranteed to pack the atmosphere with impact debris. It also hit during the rebirth of spring in the northern hemisphere, which made everything worse. There's not been a spectacle even close to this on Earth for the past 66 million years, and that's a fortunate thing. According to a Los Alamos National Lab modeling of what happened, the unimaginable ferocity of the collision blew apart a surface crater 18 miles deep and 124 miles wide within mere seconds. The hit instantly vaporized the asteroid itself, and because its strike was in ocean water, it generated tsunamis a mile tall that ricocheted off Earth's shorelines, water sloshing to and fro across a planetary bowl for weeks afterward. Those produced ripples on the ancient seafloor, the height of 5-story buildings. The next act was an ejecta of molten rock that shot into Earth's atmospheres to such heights that it rained down scalding blasts that burned the planet's vegetation to ash. That column soared so high, its top exited Earth's orbit, and over the next few million years, deposited bits of our planet across the moon, Mars, and Jupiter and its moons. Some astrobiologists believe that while Chicxulub came close to extinguishing life on Earth, its strike on a planet teeming with living things may have seeded life in the form of microbes throughout much of our solar system. Chicxulub was our premier contingency. Without it, no us. Because critical among those few survivors were small, scurrying, rat-sized creatures, warm-blooded and capable of rapid generational turnover when natural selection could work on them quickly. They were mammals, of course, and with no warning, they had now inherited a planet with thousands of vacant ecological niches to fill just as fast as evolution could shape them for the tasks. What that passage sets up, obviously, is the story of how North America acquires its bestiary, how we get all these remarkable animals that finally our animal species, we humans, will find when we migrate out of Africa into Europe and Asia and around the globe and finally discover North America and South America, the last great continents that humans find on Earth. And so the rest of that chapter essentially is how evolution and migration produce this remarkable and wonderful collection of creatures that provide us with our North American animals in terms of birds, mammals, and reptiles. So what I would say at this point, and I'm going to read you a couple of more passages in the book, but I'll save those for a little bit later. What I want to do at this point is to kind of do a little bit of a book talk for you for just a few minutes. This is out of something that I've been doing for the last year since Wild New World came out, and I've frankly done it probably 2 or 3 dozen times for various groups, various purposes, bookstores, and so forth. But I start this book talk out by simply saying this: global climate change is not the first time humanity has remade the Earth. Wild New World, obviously, as you just heard, covers 66 million years of time, although the large part of that 66 million years is covered in the first chapter, and all the remaining 10 plus an epilogue are basically about much more recent periods in history. But by framing it that way, I think it's probably the kind of book that qualifies as what some people refer to as a big history. The kind of book, for example, that Yuval Harari's Sapiens and Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel are. It's the kind of book, in other words, that takes a 20,000-foot view of the story of North America. And I will say that writing Wild New World made me understand just how crucial Earth's animal life has been throughout the human story, virtually from the very beginning of our story. In fact, the biodiversity crisis we today call the sixth extinction, I argue in Wild New World, is actually a slow motion phenomenon that we initiated long, long before modern glaciers began to melt, and long ago began changing the world dramatically by really drastically reducing biological diversity on the planet as we spread around the globe. Books obviously exist because writers are compelled by something. And I want to share a brief story, one that I tell in the book about at least one of the reasons that I wrote Wild New World. I tell this story in the book because it helped me, and I think it will help readers understand something about the ideology that old worlders brought to America with respect to humans and other animals. And as I tell it, you'll understand what I mean by this. This is my oldest memory, by the way. This is something that happened to me when I was 4 years old. I have no memories of anything any earlier. And that's probably, along with the emotional content of it, why it has stuck with me for so long. I had my first animal companion, which was a little yellow chicken of the kind you get in feed stores, that I fed and watered and played with when I was 4. Our primary play was chase, and one day as we raced through the house, I miscalculated. I was a little clumsy 4-year-old, I guess, and I stepped on my little chicken and I killed her. So as we were burying my little yellow bird out in the backyard, I turned to my mom, sobbing over this early loss in my life, with this question: I at least get to have Chicky again in heaven, don't I, Mom? A good Southern Methodist who was known all her life for delivering the unpainted version of things, my mother responded with a take on the Western view of animals that's ended up haunting me for a lot of my life, and no doubt, I think, led to the writing of Wild New World. Her response was this: why, no, honey. Chickens don't get to go to heaven. They're different from you and me. They don't have souls. You were made in the image of God and have an everlasting soul, so you'll have a life after death and go to heaven. Animals don't get to do that. They just die. I can tell you that even as a 4-year-old, that kind of human exceptionalism seemed dubious to me. And I think it probably made me think, boy, if this is how it works, I'm not sure I want to play this game. But it certainly lingered on in my mind in a disturbing way for many, many decades after. I wrote Wild New World for some other reasons too. I've more than once been sort of stunned that Americans seem to remember so little about the marvelous biological diversity our continent once held, or understand the realities of how we lost so much magic from the world. Most of us recall a kind of a shorthand story that once there were millions of buffalo and then there were almost none. But who remembers that 2 centuries ago, Atlantic shorelines still harbored a northern hemisphere penguin, the great auk? I mean, there's a reason that penguins aren't spread across the globe and are found today only in Antarctica and in the southern latitudes. We had one, but we lost it. It became extinct by the 1840s. That there was still an eastern prairie chicken called the heath hen until the early 1930s, when people sort of watched them one by one disappear until the last one, a lonely male, Booming Ben they called him, finally disappeared in 1931. When my own grandparents were alive, passenger pigeons, once the most numerous bird on Earth, not just in North America, but on the planet, we think, still flew through American skies. And as they had done for 5 million years, wolves were still engineering continental ecologies everywhere until a century ago. America's own parrot, the Carolina parakeet, our most beautiful bird, continued to lend a tropical color to eastern forests and even as far west as Colorado only 90 years ago. And ivory-bill woodpeckers, our candidate for the largest woodpecker in the world, were still available for ornithologists to study into the 1940s. Henry David Thoreau once lamented that in 1850s New England, he was not able to experience what he called an entire heaven and an entire earth. I use that phrase as a title for one of my chapters, the one about the colonial experience and early America, the early republic in American history, because so few modern Americans seem to understand what having an entire earth might have meant, or really grasp that what happened in the past doesn't stay in the past, but it creates the reality that we live in now. That absence of memory doesn't just make recovery of wolves under the Endangered Species Act more difficult in our own time. It sometimes makes me wonder about our inability to grasp that truism of history, whether humans 2 or 3 centuries from now will even understand that they live on an earth previous generations overheated, or whether they'll wonder what the planet was once like, or just assume that the world they live in is completely normal, sort of the way we seem to assume that we live in a normal world. So I'll just tell you that a book that covers this much time obviously gets to engage in a great many topics, and I'll just mention a few of them before I go on. But among them, obviously, is how America acquired that rich, distinctive bestiary that greeted the first human arrivals, how humanity's deep time and intimate relationships with other animals gave us a kind of a surviving human neurological and limbic wiring in our bodies that still informs us about other creatures around us. The fact that we still have that with us is proof positive of this ancient relationship that we have with other creatures. The book investigates American elephants and why we don't have them anymore. How a people who established our first coast-to-coast culture 13,000 years ago, I call that chapter Clovicia the Beautiful, forever transformed the ecologies on the continent. How it was that in the 10,000 years that followed, Native people largely managed to preserve American biological diversity. This is a story that I really wanted to tell because it's a remarkable one about the 10,000 years before Europeans arrived and how much marvelous biological diversity Native people preserve. I could only find evidence of one single extinction in North America during that whole 10,000 year period. And of course, how naturalists, people like Mark Catesby, William Bartram, John James Audubon, Ernest Thompson Seton, Vernon Bailey, and Florence Merriam Bailey, Adolph and Olaus Murie, Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, all the way down to the present, unlocked and are still unlocking the secrets of America's wild animals. Why Europeans were so invested in destroying the continent's wolves from the very first. This is a theme that I tracked through a great bit of the colonial period up to the present. In other words, over about 6 different chapters of the book. Why bison haven't gotten to be wild in modern America is another story I tell. How in the process of creating what we've long called the greatest nation on earth, America's market-based economy made possible 400 years of the most widespread destruction of animals anywhere in world history. And then we pronounced it an act of civilization. I'll be brief here, but I do want to tell you this. The story I tell in this book involves a theory of first contact, and it occurs in about 3 different forms. The Americas were the last continents on Earth that humans found, and we were repeatedly new to the place. So first contact theory assumes that you can only respond to brand new things or new people or new animals with the ideas you already possess, at least at first. So first contact in several forms. Biological first contact, for example, where animals with no prior experience with us had to learn to fear us. And cultural first contact, when Europeans and Native people engaged in big conceptual misses about one another. Both play really significant roles in Wild New World. But I also write about another kind of first contact I refer to as continental first contact, when more recent Americans failed to appreciate these ancient ecologies that we'd inherited, and acting on old world traditions, tried to remake America in the image of European countries, of nations that had long before already destroyed all their own largest and most charismatic animals in what they called an act of civilization. Rather than starting with something new in America, and I spent some time talking about how Aldo Leopold grappled with this, Americans instead thought that they needed to make the United States into a clone of a place like Great Britain that hadn't had wolves in it since the 1400s. And of course, all the other animals, except for deer, had already been wiped out. So it's part of our story that we didn't seem to be able to get over this kind of first continental contact and come up with something new with all the public lands that we created in America, unlike anything Europe possessed. We're still struggling to imagine our way out of this old way of thinking about creating America. There are several other things that I spend time on, the thoughts that are in our heads with respect to animals. And what I do there is to contrast ancient ideas about humans and animals, the ideas that native people preserved about their relationship, their kinship with other animals, and pose those ideas against the notions that Europeans bring, as in the story I told you about my little chicken, where we come to North America with a notion that humans are exceptional and all other creatures are created to serve human purposes. And that allows us, of course, to bring to bear the market economy on all this rich animal life that we discover in North America. And I can tell you the story is really awful. I wish I had time to kind of give you a few details about it, but I obviously describe what happens to so many of the animals that disappeared. For much of the early 19th century, operating under a religious notion about how the world worked, we didn't think extinction was possible. We thought the earth had been created perfect by a creator, and therefore no other creatures could ever become extinct. And then we began confronting creatures like the great auk, as I said. And then later on in the period of the turn of the 20th century, the extinction of how in the world we did it, since it had been here for 15 million years. But in 300 years, we managed to destroy all the passenger pigeons on the continent. We destroyed animal after animal. We reduced 100 million, or I'm sorry, 30 million bison down to fewer than 1,000 in the space of a century. So it's a kind of a stunning story that we tell ourselves in this, about ourselves in this book. And it's a story that, as I said at the outset, I don't think very many people actually know. I want to read you one other passage, and then I'm going to tell you how I usually close this book talk, which carries us up to the present day. But I wanted to read you this passage. This is the opening of chapter 9 in the book. And this chapter is called Golden-Eyed Lightning Rod. And here's how it begins. In the 1920s, as flappers and jazz and Hollywood captivate American cities, a man named Bill Kaywood is engaged in a different cultural project. At 50, Kaywood is a stocky stump of a man with a face like a granite cliff. He's a professional assassin of wolves, but he says he loves the animals he watches die. He's a real fellow, the big gray is. Lots of brains. I feel sorry every time I see one of these big fellows thrashing around in a trap bellowing bloody murder. Kaywood is the sort of American that writer D.H. Lawrence, getting his first extended exposure to this country, will describe as stoic, a killer. And what he's doing is mop-up work. Where the continent only 3 centuries before had easily held several 100,000 wolf packs, animals that had been here for 5 million years, by the 1920s, Few packs remain anywhere in the United States outside Alaska, the Great Lakes country, and the lower South. Kaywood is after the last survivors in the American West. Few enough animals that ranchers and government hunters hired on their behalf have started giving the animals individual names. They call two of these last gray wolves Kaywood is tracking down, Rags and Greenhorn. Animals that had once lived in packs, once had mates and pups, Rags and Greenhorn are enduring lives of lonely desperation. Like a significant percentage of gray wolves who turn to livestock, they're too old and frail to bring down elk without a pack's help. Younger wolves who ended up stock killers had often suffered crippling injuries, frequently by losing multiple toes or an entire foot, escaping the serrated jaws of the Newhouse number 4.5 steel trap. Rags had seen one of the two mates he had had during his lifetime panicked and helpless in a trap. He learned from that and is himself unmaimed. Rags is an old wolf. The ranchers say he's 17, but he's probably closer to 10 or 11, and now travels either alone or with two younger wolves who are far less crafty. As for Greenhorn, this female wolf, named for a local mountain near Kaywood's Front Range home, has teeth so worn she's been reduced to strangling her prey. In her past, she's escaped traps and spit out a strychnine bait before it could kill her. When Kaywood goes after her in 1923, the ranchers claim she's 18 years old. Whatever her real age, she is slowly starving to death. These are wolves the federal agency Kaywood works for should leave to die natural deaths. But Rags and Greenhorn live in a nation that cannot brook a single wolf remaining alive anywhere. It's Rags's turn first. Across weeks of time, Kaywood sets his traps and Rags digs them up. With a wolf that smart, the former bounty hunter rigs a trap set designed to snare a wolf by a back leg as it digs up other traps with its front paws. It works, with a trap biting into a rear leg and a second trap springing on the drag line of the first that's bouncing after him on a 3-foot chain. The old wolf spends a final day in tortured flight. In the end, hemmed into a box canyon, he confronts a fate he's escaped for a decade. Purposefully, he limps straight toward Kaywood, yellow eyes fixed and staring as the metal clanks over the rocks behind him. Kaywood stoically shoots the equivalent of an octogenarian wolf in the head. Next, Greenhorn. It's December, cold and snowing on the Front Range, and with her teeth mostly gone, the elderly wolf can't down a deer, let alone a cow. She's desperately hungry. She knows the scent of strychnine, but Kaywood has attracted her with a horse's head wired to a juniper, around which he's placed chunks of fat suet soaked in poison. Greenhorn shies away from the smell again and again. She knows from her own experience and from wolf culture that this scent means tragic danger. She's witnessed the thrashing, vomiting endgame more than once, but she's starving to death. She circles back, picks up a chunk of suet, and swallows it. Then another, and one more. It's the day after Christmas, 1923. Kaywood believes she's the last wild wolf born in the state of Colorado. So let me finish this up by carrying us to the last 50 years of the story. And I'll close it this way. Through much of our history, we've told ourselves that apart from the few species we saved to hunt, it was inevitable that the continent's wild animals would vanish. They were the collateral damage of progress and prosperity, after all. In fact, though, losing animals or rescuing them has usually been a deliberate choice. 50 years ago this year, We made the very deliberate choice to pass the Endangered Species Act of 1973, reversing the mindless destruction that had stood as shorthand for American colonization. The ESA rested on a premise that other living species, with which both indigenous philosophies and Darwinian science teach our earthly kin, possess one essential right, the right to exist. The U.S. Supreme Court called the ESA the most comprehensive legislation for endangered species ever enacted by any nation. I argue in Wild New World that the ESA, in fact, is one of those American moments, joining things like the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the abolition of slavery, the creation of the national parks, that shows who we are as a people. The ESA became law when saving the world was not political. It passed 492 to 12 in Congress 50 years ago. And it hasn't just brought back eagles and condors and wolves and recovered more than 50 other species. In the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's new green status list, United States species now fare significantly better than those elsewhere in the world because of our ESA and its recovery programs. Despite our own success with the ESA and our signal restoration projects, on a global scale, a third of the planet's 27,000 vertebrate species are now in decline, with a quarter of them possibly facing extinction. Since the 1970s, in just the United States, our bird population has dropped by 3 billion, a stunning 29% decline. As a result of climate change, a third to a half of all American species, at least those that can do so, are shifting their ranges, scrambling ecologies all over the continent. While we're still hoping for grand projects like recovering jaguars in the Southwest or allowing bison to be wild again, we continue to lose species from the earlier phase of our history when we basically de-buffaloed, de-wolfed, and de-pigeoned the continent. But in the big context of our national story, the Endangered Species Act remains today on the short list of America's very best ideas. It's proof that nothing in history is really inevitable. So in a nation that endeavors to lead the world by example, in the Endangered Species Act, we have evidence that change is within us. When we needed a Hail Mary to slow and even reverse what seemed unstoppable forces of destruction, we Americans actually managed to do it. That gives me hope that mindless human destruction and loss aren't inevitable, that we can, in fact, save the world and occupy an entire heaven and an entire earth. So I'll stop there. There was one other piece I was thinking I might read to you, which is actually basically the last page of the book, but writers actually should never read the last page of a book. They should let readers do that. So I'm content to let that piece sit, and I'll field whatever questions you guys have.
All right. Thanks so much, Dan. Wonderful recap and readings there. So we're opening up to Q&A. You can type a question in using the Q&A function, or if you'd like to ask your question over the Zoom waves, do the hand raise function, and I can allow you to talk with my Zoom hand of God here. But I'll get us started for the Q&A. One thing that is fun to ask authors always, but especially in this book, one thing that really stood out to me in this book is the many ways that people have their imaginations captured by animals. And I'm just curious, Dan, why you think humans have such fascination with animals, and if there were any particular people from the book or who didn't make it into the book who really stuck out to you in your process, as unique examples of a human relationship with other animals.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Matt. And I'll say that although I had a reviewer in the New York Review of Books question whether biophilia, E.O. Wilson's biophilia, is actually real. I certainly do assume that it's real, and I think it's real. And one of the reasons I think so is because of all the research I did on the early human story. I mean, by the time we got to North America, for example, we were representatives of 45 to 50,000 generations of people who had lived as predatory hunters among animals. And looking at that story, and as I mentioned in the talk a bit ago, the fact that we still have limbic and neurological wiring that causes us to pay attention to animals. And even, channeling one of Paul Shepard's points in a book of his, that there's a reason why when we hang things above babies' cradles, what we often hang are elephants and bears and birds, because this is how we classify the world at the very beginning of our knowledge of it. As we come into consciousness, what we're doing is classifying the animals around us. And Shepard argued that that was another bit of evidence that all this was really ancient to us. So that kind of thing makes me believe that E.O. Wilson was right, that there is a biophilia among humans where we have a natural love of the life that's around us and a natural fascination with other creatures. I mean, one of the things I talk about fairly early in Wild New World, sort of at the beginning or the end, I should say, of the first chapter, that a prologue in deep time, which is where I have humans evolve in Africa and migrate around the world, is this marvelous cave art in Western Europe that dates back to 35,000 years ago, which is clearly religious in nature. I mean, the animals are portrayed in a way that it's hard to miss in the so-called Cave of Forgotten Dreams, that the humans of the time really were in love with the creatures that surrounded them. So I operate from the very beginning, from a premise in this book that we have a love affair with other creatures. That obviously hasn't kept us from hunting them and killing them and using them for our own purposes. And in the story of Europeans in America, of actually converting them into commodity resources in the global market economy. But that fascination remains even among the people who were performing disgraceful acts like slaughtering snowy egrets for plume feathers, say. So I think that it's there within us. It's probably one of those kinds of things that functions through epigenetics. It's released as a result. It's part of our genetic memory, but it's released as a result of the experiences we have, which probably argues for trying to expose people as young as possible to the natural world and to other creatures, and let them naturally develop this kind of fascination with the life around us.
Yeah,
I think that answers at least part of your question.
That's a great answer, and an inspiring final note in your answer that takes me back to my days as an environmental educator for elementary kids. Start them young. We have another question from Kelly, who's one of our board members for Vital Ground. She says, "Wow, thank you, Dan. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this for Vital Ground," and she looks forward to sharing your book with many this holiday season. Kelly says she found the account of those lost wolves in Colorado very moving. Wondering if you got the information for those stories from their logs, from the hunter logs, and also more generally, just how long it took you to do so much research for this book.
Yeah, that story comes primarily from K Wood's own journals. And plus a couple of people like Michael Robinson for the Center of Biological Diversity has written about K Wood, and I used some of his pretty marvelous The Predatory Bureaucracy book and his treatment of K Wood to assemble that little brief story. K Wood's story is a much bigger one. He was kind of a model for a lot of the bounty hunters of wolves and coyotes in Montana, who pointed out to one another that K Wood killed enough wolves for bounties and for special prizes from ranchers in a single year that he was able to buy a ranch and stock it with cattle from a single year's kill. And that became sort of an inspiration for some of the hunters in Montana. Well, I will say that Wild New World rests on probably much of my career of teaching courses in American environmental history, which I always did as kind of big history courses. I always, for whatever the reason, started my courses with the Pleistocene or with the creation of the bestiary in North America and track the story on down to the present. So I've been doing that for a long time, reading people like Paul Martin many years ago, 35 or so years ago, probably. And then I taught Native American history, several different classes at the University of Montana, including a graduate class every couple of years and an upper division class I call Indians, Bison, and Horses, which always drew really great, smart people who wrote great papers. And so I will say that the graduate students at the University of Montana and the junior and senior level students who took courses like that helped me a lot because they wrote really good stuff, and I was able to draw on the research that they did. But it's kind of been, I will admit, this was my pandemic book. And so rather than hiding under the bed for 2 years, it seemed like a better use of my time to sit in my writing studio and call on my library. And I have a pretty good library down here in Santa Fe. So I was able to call on my library. And of course, a lot of what's available now online makes possible writing something like this. I mean, this book has a bibliography. I didn't use any footnotes or anything in it because I didn't want to inhibit the readability of it, but it's got a pretty extensive bibliography that came from writing several other books that have to do in various ways with this topic, American Serengeti among them, and of course, Coyote America, another one. But with the library I had here in Santa Fe, plus the ability to go online and access brand new journal articles in an instant, it was possible in 2021 and 2022 to actually sit down and put together the story that made up this book. It was daunting at the outset. There's no question about it. But for some reason, I had this crazy idea that I could do it. So I just threw myself into it and made an attempt.
We're glad you did. Question about the ESA. Someone's wondering, how widespread are ESA-like protections around the world outside of the U.S.?
Well, they've become pretty widespread. Sort of like in creating the world's first national parks, and Yellowstone was the first national park in the world. Other countries have followed suit in their own forms. And you can see it with Canadian parks, for example. Canada certainly has national parks, but they also have provincial parks that are analogous to our state parks. in the U.S. And other countries around the world have done something very similar. Mexico has obviously done the same. It's created parks along the border with Big Bend National Park in Texas, so that sort of like the park across the border from Glacier in Canada. So it's possible to have these big bodies of preserved lands. And the Endangered Species Act has been passed in different forms depending on the country. But one of the things that I was really sort of intrigued by, and I mean, I've written, which I think, I don't know exactly what issue it's going to be published in, but I think Time Magazine is going to publish my essay on the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. And one of the things I did when I was writing that essay for Time is to take a look at state Endangered Species Acts. And one of the things that immediately sticks out is that they track blue and red political barometers among the various states. The states that have the strongest state-based endangered species acts are the bluest states, like Massachusetts and California and New York State. And states like West Virginia, Alabama, Wyoming don't really have endangered species acts at all. So the Endangered Species Act itself at the state level has become another one of those barometers of the political divisions that have infected the United States in the last 30 or 40 years in particular. By the time the Endangered Species Act, of course, was about 10 years old, the Republican Party, frankly, had decided that it was the worst legacy of the age of ecology, and has sort of fought it tooth and nail. I mean, the Trump administration really attempted to gut the Endangered Species Act while Trump was in office. And as some of you know, he, of course, sort of very quickly managed to return to states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Western Rocky Mountain states too, state management of gray wolf recovery. So yeah, it's another interesting story. One of the things that I have said to people fairly frequently as I've talked about this book is I actually think what Wild New World, the story that Wild New World tells, and as long and epic as it is, when you get to the present, it's telling a story that we haven't finished yet, that is still in the process of unfolding. And it's fascinating to kind of think of it that way, because clearly there's still a trajectory towards the future. And there are at least two very separate visions of what that future looks like for endangered species in this country.
Yeah, that segues to another question about the ESA, which Jamie writes that she knows the ESA has come under attack in recent years. There's some legislatures who've tried to embed quote economic considerations into it, and she's wondering if you know if any of these attacks have been successful in eroding the act, and whether you worry that it's more vulnerable than we think.
Well, I think it's politically vulnerable because she's right. The Trump administration attempted to, I mean, the original act, of course, argued that only the best science would be taken into consideration when determining listing of species. And the Trump administration attempted and did so briefly through a new rule that they were going to inject economics and economic considerations into listings and delistings. When the Biden administration came in, they immediately reversed that. But what that sort of tells you is that, like so many of the great progressive legislation that we've put in place in America, from civil rights to environmental legislation, those acts they function as intended only so long as the American public and the American political parties believe in them and believe in their future. There was and I've forgotten the guy's name. I knew it a few weeks ago, but the chair of the Natural Resources Committee in the House said about 3 months ago, earlier this year, this past summer, that as far as he was concerned, the Endangered Species Act was a relic of a gone by time and didn't apply to the future United States. Well, that kind of thinking is obviously scary as hell to those of us who believe that this is an act like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, for example, that ended slavery and made African Americans citizens in the United States, are like amendments that provided women the right to vote, that these things you can't go back. I mean, I think we're confronting right now in the elections from last night, the reaction of the country when Roe v. Wade has gotten reversed from 50 years ago. And the country clearly doesn't seem to be accepting of that reversal. And that's what I hope for these great progressive acts from half a century ago that are on our books in terms of civil rights, in terms of environmental legislation, in terms of something like Roe v. Wade, is that as we go forward, we've become used enough to how these progressive acts function in American life that we're not going to allow them to be reversed or gutted. And I think, as I said, what happened in the elections last night and has happened in places like Kansas, for example, a couple of years ago, is an indication that even red states are not going to allow the kinds of changes that some of the conservative wing of one of our major parties is trying to implement.
All right. Doug, another question from Doug McCartney, says he recently read and loved your book, and wondering what you're working on next. Are you working on another book, and what's it about?
Well, I have begun work on another book. I haven't let my editor in New York see it yet. Haven't told him about it, although I think he suspects I'm probably working on something. And I haven't showed it to my agent either. So I've been kind of keeping it under wraps. But I can tell you at the moment I'm calling it Homestead, and it's not a memoir. I mean, I'm a little uneasy with writing autobiographical things. I put a few things in my books that are like that, but I don't think anybody but my mother would be interested in my life story. So what I'm intending with this book is to write about 3 places that in my adult life, one of them was in West Texas in a place called Yellow House Canyon. One of them was in Montana in the Bitterroot Valley up in the foothills of the Sapphires, where I built a place from kind of blank ground. And the other one is here in New Mexico outside Santa Fe, where I kind of done the same thing. 3 different times I've taken a piece of ground, and what I've done is kind of the reverse of 19th century homesteading, where the idea was to take a piece of natural ground and turn it into a economic or money-making proposition. I've sort of done the opposite. I've taken a piece of ground like the one in Montana, for example, which had been badly overgrazed and was covered in spotted knapweed when I bought it, had actually been logged at one point in its history, had clearly been mined. It looked like Chinese miners had worked the draw that ran through it. And what I tried to do was to return it to a natural state in order to make it more inviting for elk and black bears. And as we got wolves recovered in the Sapphire Mountains, wolves to come onto the place and more deer. So it's a kind of a small scale private land story of rewilding, I think. Kind of a reverse, as I said, of homesteading in the 19th century. And it's the kind of thing I think it's possible to do in the modern age, because we can now work from isolated places. I mean, I have satellite internet here in New Mexico as I did in Montana. I mean, obviously, I'm able to walk over to my studio and do a Zoom, and you can clearly make a living from a place like this, but you don't have to do it by converting it into some sort of economic purpose, by raising animals on it or growing some sort of massive wheat crop or something like that. So anyway, I'm not very far along on it, but that's what I think I'm probably going to do. Thanks for asking too and being interested.
That's exciting. We'll keep an eye out for that, and maybe there'll be a grizzly or two on that property in the sapphires eventually.
I
we
hope
just
so.
got we just got a great note on that to that end from Jamie Drysdale, who is currently watching the webinar from the house that you, Dan, built in the Bitterroot
Hello,
Valley.
Jamie.
So Jamie says she's happy to report the natural state is continually returning and still no knapweed.
Still no knapweed. I worked hard to get rid of it.
We can all be happy about that.
No kidding.
One other quick question. Someone is asking if there is a particular book that you recommend about wolf history in Colorado or otherwise.
Well, I think one of the ones I certainly have enjoyed, and I blurbed it for him, is Nate Blakesley's American Wolf, which is the story of 06. But looks like Matt is reaching for it. He's probably got it in his library. I think that is a pretty remarkable book, and one of the reasons it's remarkable, two reasons I think. One is, yep, there we go. One is
always helps to know what it looks like.
Yeah, Nate is a really superb writer. He's a staff writer for Texas Monthly, and somebody I know. In fact, he blurred Wild New World for me. But the other thing, of course, is that Rick McIntyre generously and other wolf watchers in the Lamar Valley region let Nate take a look at their journals. And Rick McIntyre's journals obviously are priceless because he's the guy working for the Park Service who vowed sometimes for 3 or 4 years at a time that he would not leave the park any day until he had a wolf sighting. And I've forgotten how many consecutive days was his top one, but it was well over 1,000 and maybe approaching 1,500 days where he would have a wolf sighting day after day after day. And then he would go home and very carefully write up his account of that. And of course, Rick is publishing a series of books on the wolves of Yellowstone. He's gotten at least 3 of them out at this point, maybe 4. I write about them in Wild New World in the epilogue chapter. But yeah, any of Rick's books, but probably particularly Nate Blakesley's is the one that I really like.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that recommendation. American Wolf by Nate Blakesley. It's a great, quick-paced, but very informative and very moving book, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, great. I think the last question that I always like to ask is how you would recommend folks get a hold of Wild New World. What's your preferred way for folks to get a hold of the book?
Well, it's in a lot of bookstores. I mean, it's published with a pretty big New York press, W.W. Norton, and one of the things I've noticed about them is this is my first book with Norton. I mean, they are remarkable in landing this book in bookstores. So in order to support your local bookstores and help them survive, I would say the first act is to see if your local bookstore has it. If they don't, obviously Amazon does. And I will point out the book has last week, 2 weeks ago, it reached the milestone of being out for a year. And as part of the 1-year anniversary, Norton released the paperback version of it. And so it is available in a paperback. I don't know exactly what the bookstores are selling it for. I think probably about $19 or $20. I noticed today that the paperback on Amazon is selling for about $17, $16.95 or something like that. So there is a pretty inexpensive way of getting it. But if you don't mind spending a little bit more money and helping a local business out, I would certainly encourage you to start out by going to the local bookstore and trying there.
Good deal. And stay tuned. We can follow up on this, Dan, but there's a chance we might even be able to get a hold of some copies for Vital Grounds little online store as well. But certainly we'll echo the recommendation to check out your local bookstore. And it's perfect time to be buying folks books for the cold weather. So thank you very much, Dan. We'll call it a night unless anyone has last questions. I did see Kelly, your electronic hand went up for a moment. If you had a last thought to share, I can allow you to talk here. There we go.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you can hear me. But
yes,
Dan, I really appreciate what you're doing for Vital Ground. Kelly Johnson, I'm the chair of Vital Ground. And I just want to say thank you for writing this book. And we are the ones that can speak for those that can't speak. And that's our wild creatures. And I really appreciate you taking the time and writing this wonderful book. And I look forward to sharing it with everybody. And thank you for taking the time for Vital Ground. And
my pleasure.
yeah, and Kim and Matt, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Great job. Really informative.
All right. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Great way to close out. And I'll just say thanks again, everyone, for attending and for supporting Vital Ground in whatever way you do. And we look forward to keeping in touch with you all through email and our social media channels. And we'll see you for the next one of these. And go get some reading done. It's hibernation season.
Indeed.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thanks again, Dan.
You bet, Matt.